In the last video, we examined the first structure of consciousness explicated by Jean Gebser within his work, The Ever-Present Origin. This was what he calls the archaic structure, a form of consciousness which consists of pure, undifferentiated identity, in which the human sense of self-world division remained unrealized. In this video, we will be moving on to look at the second, or magical, structure of consciousness, in which dimensionless identity gives way to one-dimensional unity, and the human soul emerges in its most primordial modality. Previously, I suggested that the emergence of language, or at least the emergence of symbolic consciousness, which conditions the possibility of language, may have been the dividing line between archaic and magical consciousness. Through developing a capacity for symbolic reference, early humanity may have thus developed the conditions for human thought as such. In order to illustrate what I have in mind here, I would like to first examine the phenomenon of tool usage among animals, and the phenomenon of artifact creation among humans, as this may allow us to bring into focus the contrast which is of most significance regarding the dimensionality of consciousness. It was once commonly suggested that tool usage was the crucial and unique feature of human beings which separated us from all other living things. Yet, since the 1950s, a steady stream of ethological research has shown rather definitively that tool usage is far from being the exclusive purview of humans. Not only our primate relatives, but also birds, elephants, and even invertebrates such as cephalopods can be observed to use objects within their environment to accomplish certain tasks. Such tool usage is certainly indicative of intelligence, yet I do nevertheless believe that human beings possess faculties of consciousness which no other creatures seem to express. One feature of human behavior which truly seems unique to our species is artifact creation, which is, I will argue, qualitatively distinct from tool usage as such in terms of cognitive requirements. Tool usage requires that a creature engage with possibilities and manipulate objects within their environment in such a way as to bring about certain outcomes rather than others. A chimpanzee or bonobo might look at a stone and see that the object is capable of breaking open the shell of a nut, or an orangutan might observe that a long branch might be used as a spear for fishing. Yet I would contend that when a human being looks to objects within our environment, we see much more than what other primates see. We see not only the form of an object, and the possible uses of that object due to its form, but further we see also the forms which are not present within an object, and forms that could be present within an object. Chipping it away at a piece of flint in order to create an arrowhead might seem like a simple task, but it requires that a creature look to the piece of flint and see what the object could be as well as what it is, and imagine the ways in which the object might be altered so as to reveal such latent possibilities. What is required for such behavior is imagination. That is, the capacity to cognize forms, not as they appear within certain objects, but rather as they are in themselves. To carve an arrowhead, I must cognize the form of the arrowhead itself, independently of the piece of flint before me, which is not yet partaking in that form. This capacity for consciousness to give shape to artifacts such as arrowheads, spears, axes, or campfires is very closely related to our capacity for language, as both language and artifact creation require human consciousness to engage with forms as such, independently of particular instantiations of such forms. A word is a symbol, which may refer to a range of distinct objects, places, or situations. Yet in cognizing a word itself, we are able to bring our awareness to bear upon the forms which the symbol refers to, independently of any particular objects, places, or situations. It is thus our capacity to engage our consciousness with form, or rather, spirit, which is the emergence of unity as the first dimension of human consciousness. In becoming conscious of form, we become conscious of unity, as form is that which unifies multiplicities. That which is unified by spirit may be separate, yet not distinct, as various instances of spirit are seen to share in a oneness, which is more fundamental than any separation through what we would understand as time and space. As we shall see, the magical structure itself is a form of consciousness which is both spaceless and timeless, in the sense that space and time are not available as dimensions within which magical consciousness can bring beings within the world into relation. Magical consciousness, being unidimensional, understands reality as spirit, within which space and time are not seen to be present. Through this emergence of symbolic consciousness, the magical structure of consciousness thereby comes to be born. Unfortunately, symbolic thought and spoken language do not directly leave behind fossils or artifacts. But if we wish to attempt to put this transformation on a historical timeline, we can at least look to evidence of artifice among our distant ancestors as an approximate indication of when the emergence of magical consciousness may have occurred. The earliest known use of tools among our hominid ancestors are sharpened stones attributed to Homo habilis and dated to approximately 2.6 million years before the present. By 1.6 million years ago, early Homo sapiens were creating stone hand axes, with clear indications that these artifacts had been shaped by human ingenuity. Such evidence is far from definitive, as magical consciousness may have existed in the form of spoken language long before such practices of artifice came about. And with regards to the earliest examples of Homo habilis, it may be that such artifacts were shaped by usage rather than intentional artifice. Nevertheless, we can at least give a very broad and provisional speculation that symbolic consciousness, and thus magical consciousness, may have emerged within human beings somewhere between 3 and 1.6 million years ago. Magical consciousness, Gebser tells us, is point-like. All is understood in terms of unity, and thus magical consciousness sees no distinction between parts and wholes. An individual arrowhead is not a representative of a form which exists independently of particular arrowheads. Rather, each arrowhead is understood to be identical with the spirit which is the reality of the arrowheads. Within magical consciousness, there is therefore no distinction between spirit and matter. As an example of this, we might look to the use of language in various folk tales of the indigenous peoples of North America. In such narratives, it is very common for figures such as coyote or crow to be referred to in such a manner that the species name, for example, coyote, is used as a proper name for the figure within the narrative. The figure within the tale is not a coyote, but rather is coyote, understood to be a unitary, singular spirit, one which is identical with all coyotes in the world. All coyotes are thus identical with the spirit that is coyote, and all crows are identical with the spirit that is crow. Spirit is a point-like unity, which is not considered to be distinct in any way from actuality. I should mention here that Gebser's understanding of dimensionality is not exactly equivalent to what we find in mathematics. By mathematical definitions, a point is considered to have 0 dimensions, as a point does not allow for any relationships between distinct variables unless another point is added, in which case a single dimension of distance comes into play and the concept of the line emerges. Gebser instead understands the point to be a single dimension, and that the point represents relationships of unity between distinct objects, events, or actions which magical consciousness is able to apprehend. Objects, events, or actions which are in magical sympathy or resonance with one another are of a common unity in which all parts, or points, are equivalent to one another, and all parts are equivalent to the unitary whole. Just as there is no clear delineation within magical consciousness of parts and wholes, there is likewise not yet a distinction of transcendence from immanence, no divide between form and substance, or spirit from matter. There is, however, the emerging awareness of a distinction between human beings and the world. Human consciousness is no longer simply identical with the world, but rather human magical consciousness is now felt to inhabit a world. From this sense of separation, our sense of being within a world then becomes a will to have a world, to control, alter, or contend with a world which is now felt to be something other than ourselves. Quote, "Man replies to the forces streaming towards him with his own corresponding forces. He stands up to nature. He tries to exercise her, to guide her. He strives to be independent of her. Then he begins to be conscious of his own will. Witchcraft and sorcery, totem and taboo, are the natural means by which he seeks to free himself from the transcendent power of nature, by which his soul strives to materialize within him and to become increasingly conscious of itself." End quote. The birth of the magical structure is thus the birth of the human soul, and the birth of man's will to exercise power over nature. The birth of magical consciousness is the birth of the human being as a being which makes and fabricates, and thereby comes to be a wielder of a power which is felt to be distinct, though continuous with the powers of non-human nature. Yet within magical consciousness, the soul or self-identity of humanity remains uncentered, not yet having receded into the locus of the individual person. The souls of human beings remain in some sense collective, tribal souls, in that the identity of an individual is not yet felt to be distinguishable from the identity of the tribe or clan with which he is embedded and interwoven. One might say that the individual within magical consciousness can only be understood and defined in relation to the group. Who one is a matter primarily of familial relations, not of a self-identity which is independent of such relations. To put this in mythical terms, we could say that the magical soul is lunar, but not yet solar in its essence. Moving forward, we will next look to some examples of magical practices which Gebser details within the ever-present origin in order to illustrate the nature of magical consciousness. The first example Gebser gives is one derived from a book called Unknown Africa, first published in 1905 by the ethnographer Leo Forbinius. Therein, Forbinius describes a hunting ritual practiced by the indigenous Pygmy peoples of the African Congo. In conducting this ritual, the band of Pygmy hunters draw an effigy of an antelope in the sand just before daybreak. As the first ray of sunlight touches the sand drawing, a hunter then fires an arrow into the sand, striking the effigy in the neck. Later, the hunters return with a slain antelope, with the killing arrow having struck the creature in precisely the location on the neck indicated by the firing of the original arrow into the sand effigy. The sand drawing is then erased and the ritual is complete. Significantly, the entire process of creating as well as erasing the drawing are done in total, reverential silence. We might be tempted to understand such a practice first within mental, rationalistic terms. The ritual practice is one by which the hunters attune their minds and bodies for the activity of the hunt, and thus in a loose sense the magical practice can be understood to cause the success of the hunt and even the destination of the killing arrow. Yet to truly understand such a practice, we must first understand it on its own terms. That is to say that we must understand it as an enactment of magical consciousness. Within magical consciousness, there is no consciousness of space and time as we understand those notions, and thus no notion of causation comes into play within such a ritual. The act of firing an arrow into the neck of the sand effigy does not cause the hunters to then successfully kill the antelope by firing an arrow into its neck. Rather, the act of firing the arrow into the sand effigy is understood to be a unison with the act of actually killing the antelope. The two events are not separate, but rather are two instances of the same spiritual event, which exists without any reference to space or time. The firing of the arrow into the neck of the sand effigy is the killing of the antelope. Gebser then brings our attention to the practice of cave painting, with prehistoric examples found throughout various parts of the world. Gebser indicates that these cave paintings seem to be magical effigies in a similar manner to the sand drawings created by Pygmy hunters. Such cave paintings commonly depict animals, and such effigies are often seen to be penetrated by depictions of arrows. Yet Gebser also notes that there appears to be one crucial dissimilarity of such cave paintings from the Pygmy hunting ritual. While the sun is a central actor in the Pygmy hunting ritual, Gebser notes that many cave paintings are found specifically within the darkest interiors of the caves in which they are located, such that sunlight is not able to reach them. Gebser suggests that this fact is an indication that such cave paintings are representative of a much earlier form of magical consciousness than that represented by the Pygmy hunting ritual. I would add that the darkness of the inner caves may have served an analogous magical purpose as the silence with which the Pygmy hunters conducted the creation and erasure of their sand effigy. It is through silence, stillness, and darkness that magic is able to manifest, as such emptiness shares in the spiritual essence of the primordial womb that is the earth. By descending into the earth through birth canal-like caverns, human beings of magical consciousness feel themselves to be descending towards the source of nature's transcendental powers, from which man believed himself to have originated. Thereby, human beings attempted to wield or invoke the powers of the Great Mother, or powers of life and death. The Pygmy hunting ritual, insofar as it calls upon the power of the sun, is representative of a form of magical consciousness which has become further removed from the power of the primordial womb, and has come to see the sun, that is, the archetypal soul, as a source of magical power. We see again the magical significance of silence as Gebser takes note of various paintings, carvings, and figurines which depict human-like forms, but which notably do not feature the depiction of a mouth. In addressing these effigies, Gebser suggests that their mouthlessness is indicative of consciousness which remains primarily auditory, as yet still lacking the centrality of speech, which is characteristic of the verbal, mythical structure of consciousness. I would add that this mouthlessness may also be indicative of the nature of unity and magical thinking. Magical consciousness makes no clear distinction between symbol and symbolized. Remember that in our example of the pygmy hunting ritual, we saw a unity of spirit in the ritual, as well as within the act of hunting and killing the antelope. As such, the people who created such humanoid figures would not have understood these depictions to represent ancestral spirits or deities, but rather would have understood them to be ancestral spirits or deities. In giving such a painting or figure a mouth, the creator would have thereby given the spirit the capacity to speak, and thus the capacity to perform magical spells. The mouthlessness of such depictions might thus be understood as a precautionary measure. Fundamental to the magical structure is the relationship between human beings and the primordial Great Mother goddess, with examples of this archetype being found ubiquitously throughout innumerable prehistoric cultures, and with residual forms to be found throughout virtually all extant cultures. We can understand the Great Mother to represent the earth itself, with its fecundity taken to be the feminine, maternal power of birth. However, we might also take the Great Mother to be representative of the oceanic, womb-like nature of archaic consciousness, from which magical consciousness came to emerge. As human consciousness came to rupture apart from its archaic identity with nature, and thus came to see nature as something which human consciousness might strive to command and master, human beings would attempt to achieve control by retrieving the power of the primordial womb from which all things come to life. Magical practices, as already indicated, often require silence, stillness, and darkness. And these forms of cessation can be understood as means of re-invoking the undifferentiated oneness of archaic consciousness by facilitating the cessation of the sense of self-world distinction. Thereby, such magic would be able to evoke the life-bestowing power of the primordial womb in the service of a human consciousness. Here we see the Utroba Cave, located in modern-day Bulgaria. Also known as the Womb Cave, this naturally formed cave was carved so as to express the appearance of the uterus, birth canal, and vulva. The site is believed to date to approximately 480 BC. Within the ceiling of the cave is a carved opening, which allows a phallus-like beam of light to enter the cave. Within the center of the cave is an altar, which the phallic beam of light only comes into contact with once every year during February or March. The site is believed to have been created as a fertility shrine, and even today, modern peoples sometimes travel to the site in hopes that the otherworldly power of the cave might aid in conception. As a final illustration of magical consciousness, I would now like to examine practices involving the use of the minerals ochre and cinnabar. During the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras of human history, such minerals were commonly used as a red pigment within ritual practices. Such red minerals were considered to be the blood of the great earth goddess from which all life emerges, and thus to be capable of invoking the spiritual powers of life and death. Red ochre or cinnabar were often used within or above burial sites, perhaps indicating that human beings of magical consciousness understood death to be a returning of the body to the primordial womb from which it originated, and thus perhaps such red minerals were understood as the menstrual blood of the earth, with the implication being that such blood held the power of life and thus the power to ensure the rebirth of the deceased. Red mineral pigments were also used to cover the hair and bodies of individuals, and we even see this practice still extant today in some parts of Africa, wherein such minerals also serve the practical purposes of protection from insects and sunlight. Such practices were described by the paleoanthropologist André Leroy Gourhan in his 1968 text, The Art of Prehistoric Man in Western Europe. Quote, "The use of ochre is particularly intensive. It is not unusual to find a layer of the cave floor impregnated with a purplish red to a depth of 8 inches. The size of these ochre deposits raises a problem not yet solved. The coloring is so intense that practically all the loose ground seems to consist of ochre. One can imagine that the Aurignacians regularly painted their bodies red, dyed their animal skins, coated their weapons, and sprinkled the ground of their dwellings, and that a paste of ochre was used for decorative purposes in every phase of their domestic life. We must assume no less if we are to account for the veritable mines of ochre in which some of them lived." End quote. We see another significant and illustrative example of such practices within the megalithic temples of Malta, which were constructed in multiple stages between 3600 and 2500 BC. The interior walls and ceilings of these ovilinear temples were decorated with red ochre. This would seem to indicate that these temples were intended to be artificial caverns, that is, artificial wombs of the Great Mother, within which magical powers could be invoked. However, it is worth noting that, like the pygmy hunting ritual discussed previously, the Maltese megalithic temples seem to be an expression of a later form of magical consciousness, particularly in that the Maltese temples are believed to have been constructed to be in alignment with astronomical and thus astrological processions. Although there is some debate regarding what celestial bodies or constellations might have been most significant to the creation of these temples, it is the very fact that these temples were constructed with astrology in mind that indicates a later development of magical consciousness. This attention to the celestial realm, along with the artificial nature of the megalithic structures themselves, suggests that the creators of these temples were not only concerned with evoking the magical powers of the primordial womb, but also with bringing that power into contact with the correlative spiritual powers of the sky. Phallic starlight would enter into the megalithic womb as magical power is invoked through the coalescence of masculine and feminine spiritual mana. As humanity would continue to turn its gaze upward to the celestial realm, and away from the primordial womb of archaic consciousness from which we emerged, human consciousness would begin to open up another, second dimension within itself, and the polarity of the mythical structure would begin to grow from within the unidimensionality of the magical. But the magical structure is not something that we simply left behind in our prehistoric or tribalistic past. All consciousness structures grow out from one another. A more recent or higher dimensional structure always emerges from the soil of a previous lower dimensional structure, and the lower dimensional structures thus always remain beneath the surface as the foundations of higher dimensional structures. As previously indicated, the magical structure is pre-egoic, as magical consciousness regards parts and wholes as equivalent and interchangeable. Such consciousness therefore does not properly distinguish individual personhood from the identity of the tribe. For the modern psyche, magical consciousness thus emerges most fully when the individual ego subsides or is sedated. An example of such invocation of the magical structure could be the feeling of collective, Dionysian vitality and ecstasy felt at a rock music concert or a sporting event. The ego is lost to the unity of the tribal pulse, a state which can be one of immense euphoria, but which might also prove to be immensely dangerous and destructive if such vital energies are not properly directed and contained. The more unaware we are of this pre-egoic sphere within ourselves, the more vulnerable that part of us will be to influences which slip below the scrutiny of our egoic consciousness. Tribalistic fantasies of we and they, demarcated by isms and shibboleths, may prove to be particularly dangerous in our current age. We inhabit a world which is devoid of the extended familial clans which structured the world of prehistoric, magical humanity, and thus more so than ever we find that the pre-egoic, magical aspects of our consciousness are vacant and unguarded, vulnerable to manipulation by whatever forces, intentional or otherwise, might come to stir that which resides within the collective realm of our psyches. In an age of omnipresent mass media consumption in which collective narratives are covertly pruned, weighted, and attuned by powerful media empires, along with national and international power structures, an awareness of the magical consciousness within us may be of particularly crucial importance. Yet our modern standpoint is also privileged. Those who lived during the age of magical consciousness, in which such magical consciousness was predominant, lack the capacity to bring those aspects of psyche into the light of rational consciousness, as such consciousness simply was not yet available to humanity prior to the emergence of the mental consciousness structure. Yet today, it is now possible for the magical structure within the modern psyche to be cultivated and directed by the ego rationality of the individual self, and we thus may be capable of taking hold of those forces which otherwise might compel us to destructive ends by manipulation of our collective consciousness. Although there is certainly immense danger in the forces which reside beneath the oceanic depths of the human psyche, there is also undoubtedly the potential for immense creative and vitalizing power, which modern depth psychology has only begun to bring into the light of our conscious awareness. And that's going to be a wrap for this week, guys. Hope you liked it. This is episode 2 of 5, so if you would like to see more regarding the ever-present origin, then be sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. I've got 3 more videos on Gebser, which I'll be finishing up over the course of the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that, and thank you so much for watching.